My father looked me in the eye and said I was the one draining the family, and 3 weeks later, he was calling me 27 times a day like I was the only person who could fix his life. I didn't react right away when he said it, not because it didn't land, but because it landed exactly where he intended, right in the middle of a quiet dinner where everyone else suddenly found their plates more interesting than the conversation, and I remember setting my fork down carefully, not making a sound, because in my family even the smallest reaction had a way of being turned against you later, and I had learned that lesson early, the hard way, over years of being the one who adjusted. The one who stayed calm, the one who made things easier for everyone else while somehow becoming the easiest person to blame. "I'm sorry you feel that way, Dad," I said, keeping my voice level, respectful, exactly the way I had been taught to speak to him, even when he wasn't offering me the same courtesy, and he let out this short laugh, not loud, but sharp enough that it cut through the room and made my younger cousin shift uncomfortably in her chair, because everyone there understood what that tone meant. It wasn't humor, it was dismissal. "Feel?" he repeated, leaning back like he had just proven a point no one else could see. "This isn't about feelings, Tige, this is about facts. You take, you rely, and you give nothing back," and that was the moment I realized he wasn't speaking to me, not really, he was performing, building a version of me that fit whatever story he needed to justify what he was about to do next, and I could see it in the way my mother stayed silent, in the way my sister avoided eye contact, in the way the room seemed to tighten around his words like everyone was waiting for me to argue so they could confirm whatever he believed about me, but I didn't argue. I just folded my hands in front of me and said, "I've always tried to contribute where I could, and I meant it, even if no one at that table was interested in hearing it." But he didn't even let me finish. "Tried isn't the same as done," he cut in, his voice colder now, more final. "You're an adult, Tige. If you're going to keep acting like this, then you can find somewhere else to live." And there it was, not an emotional outburst, not a heated argument, but a decision, clean and deliberate, delivered like it had been sitting in his mind long before that dinner ever started, and for a second, just 1 second, the room went completely still, like everyone had collectively decided to hold their breath and see what I would do, and I remember looking at him, really looking at him, trying to understand if there was any part of this that wasn't intentional, but there wasn't. He had already moved on, already convinced himself he was right, already prepared to walk away from whatever came next, and that was when something shifted in me, not anger, not panic, just clarity. "If that's what you want, Dad," I said quietly, meeting his eyes without raising my voice, "I won't make this harder than it needs to be." And I could feel the tension change again, not because they expected me to fight, but because they didn't expect me not to, and for the first time that night, he hesitated, just slightly, like my lack of resistance didn't fit the outcome he had imagined, but it passed quickly, replaced by that same certainty he had started with. "Good," he said, standing up like the conversation was already over, "then we understand each other." And just like that, it was done, no discussion, no second thoughts, just a line drawn so clean it almost felt unreal, and as I stood up from the table, I didn't look at anyone else, not my mother, not my sister, not the people who had watched it happen without saying a word, because I already knew what I would see if I did, so I just nodded once and said, "I'll be out tonight," and walked away before anyone could decide to change their mind, because I understood something in that moment that they didn't, something I didn't say out loud, not then, not yet, and as I stepped outside into the cold night air with nothing but my keys and my phone, I didn't feel lost, I didn't feel desperate, I just felt quiet, the kind of quiet that comes right before everything changes, and I remember thinking, very clearly, he thinks he just got rid of the problem, and I didn't correct him, not even once, because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is let people believe exactly what they want, until they realize they were wrong. I packed quietly because there was no reason to make it dramatic, no reason to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing me hesitate, and that was the part that seemed to unsettle them the most, not the fact that I was leaving, but the way I was doing it without resistance, without noise, like I had already accepted something they had not even considered yet. And when I walked back into the dining room to grab my bag, my mother finally spoke, her voice softer than before but still distant. "You do not have to rush, Tige, we can talk about this in the morning." And I paused just long enough to acknowledge her. "I appreciate that, Mom," But I think it is better if I follow through tonight, and she nodded in that careful way people do when they want to appear reasonable without actually changing anything, while my sister avoided looking at me completely, scrolling through her phone like the entire situation was just background noise, and my father did not say another word. He had already moved on, already convinced himself the problem had been handled, and that told me everything I needed to know about how final this decision was to him. So I stepped outside, closed the door behind me, and stood there for a second in the driveway, not because I did not know where to go, but because I wanted to feel the weight of the moment clearly, without anyone else's voice shaping it for me. And then I got into my car and left without looking back. Not once. The first night was not dramatic either. There was no scene, no breakdown, just a motel off the highway with a flickering sign and a front desk clerk who barely looked up when I handed him my card. And I remember thinking how strange it was that something so life-altering could feel so quiet, like the world had not even noticed the shift. And I sat on the edge of the bed, phone in my hand, expecting something, a message, a call, some indication that maybe someone had reconsidered. But the screen stayed dark, and after a while I placed it face down on the nightstand and said to myself, all right, then we move forward, not as a question, but as a decision. The next morning started earlier than usual because uncertainty does that. It forces you into motion before you are ready, and I drove across town to a small cafe I used to pass on my way to work, ordered coffee I did not really want, and opened my laptop to start figuring out what came next. And that was when the practical part of me took over completely, the part that had always been there, just never acknowledged. I reviewed my accounts, my options, my contacts, building a plan piece by piece, not out of panic, but out of necessity, and by noon I had already secured a temporary place, a short-term lease in a small studio apartment above a retail strip, nothing impressive, but clean, private, and mine. And when the landlord handed me the key, I thanked him sincerely because I meant it. Stability is not something you take for granted when it disappears that quickly. The days that followed settled into a rhythm faster than I expected. Work, errands, setting up the space, small tasks that created structure where there had been none, and through all of it, my phone remained silent, no missed calls, no messages, not even a single check-in, and that silence was louder than anything they could have said, because it confirmed what I had already started to understand. This was never meant to be temporary. It was not a moment of anger, it was a decision they were comfortable living with. And instead of hurting, that realization made everything clearer, sharper, like the noise had finally been removed from something I had been trying to interpret for years. About a week in, I ran into an old colleague at a grocery store, someone who recognized me before I recognized her, and she smiled warmly. Tige, it has been a while, how have you been? And for a split second I considered giving the easy answer, the polite version, but something in me had shifted, so I said, I am adjusting. But I am good. And she studied my face for a moment before nodding. You always were, and that stayed with me longer than I expected, not because it was flattering, but because it was accurate in a way no one at home had ever acknowledged. By the end of the second week, everything felt steady, not perfect, not comfortable, but controlled, like I had finally stepped into a version of my life where my choices actually belonged to me. And still, no one reached out, not my father, not my mother, not my sister. And that silence stopped feeling like rejection and started feeling like distance, the kind of distance that gives you perspective whether you asked for it or not. And I realized then that whatever they believed about me, whatever narrative they had built to justify that night, they were still living inside it, completely unaware of the part they had overlooked, the detail they had dismissed because it did not fit their version of events. And I had not corrected them, not once, because I understood something they did not. Something that would not matter immediately, but would matter very soon. And as I locked the door to my apartment one evening and set my phone down on the counter, still untouched, still silent, I allowed myself one quiet thought, not out of bitterness, but certainty. They think this is over, and I let that belief sit exactly where it was, because correcting it too early would have ruined everything. I stopped checking my phone entirely by the start of the third week because silence, when it stretches long enough, stops feeling like something temporary and starts feeling like a decision that has already been made, and I respected it for what it was, not as rejection, but as confirmation, and that made it easier to focus on what was in front of me instead of what had been left behind. And my routine became precise in a way it had never been before. Mornings started at 6, coffee measured. The same way every day, laptop open by 6:30, reviewing work, tracking numbers, handling responsibilities that had always existed but had never been fully mine until now, and there was something almost unsettling about how quickly everything stabilized once the noise was gone, like I had stepped into a version of my life that had been waiting for me to arrive, and I remember standing in my small kitchen one evening, looking around at the clean counters, the quiet space, the absence of tension, and thinking, this is what control feels like, not loud, not dramatic, just steady, consistent, and entirely mine. It was during that third week that the first shift happened, not in my life, but in theirs, although I did not know it yet, because from my perspective nothing had changed. My phone still showed no missed calls, no messages, no attempt at contact, and that absence had become so normal that I barely noticed it anymore, until one afternoon at work when a number I did not recognize appeared on my screen, and for a moment I simply stared at it, not because I was surprised, but because I understood immediately what it meant, not the details, but the timing, and timing, in situations like this, is never random. I let it ring out without answering, not out of spite, but out of discipline, because whatever had changed on their side had nothing to do with urgency on mine, and a few seconds later, a voicemail notification appeared, and I did not listen to it right away either. I finished what I was doing first, closed out my work, packed my bag, and only then, sitting in my car with the engine off, did I press play. His voice came through sharper than I expected, controlled, but strained in a way I had never heard from him before. Tige, call me back when you get this. We need to talk. No explanation, no acknowledgement of what had happened. Just an assumption that I would respond, that I would step back into the same dynamic we had always had, and I set the phone down on the passenger seat without reacting, because that tone told me more than any explanation could have. It told me he was not calling to apologize, he was calling because something required my attention, and that distinction mattered more than anything else. By the next morning, there were 3 more missed calls, then 5 by midday, and by the time I got home that evening, the number had reached 11, each one closer together than the last, like whatever had prompted the first call had not resolved itself the way he expected, and I listened to the second voicemail while standing by my kitchen counter, arms folded, calm, detached. Tige, I am serious, call me back, this is important. The word important stretched slightly, pressed harder than necessary, and I almost smiled at that, not because it was amusing, but because it confirmed what I had already started to see. This was not about me anymore, it was about something he needed, something he could not fix on his own. And still, I did not call back, not that day, not the next, because whatever urgency he felt now was built on the assumption that I would respond the same way I always had, quickly, reliably, without question, and that assumption was the one thing I was no longer willing to support. By the end of the third week, the pattern had become impossible to ignore. Calls in the morning, calls in the afternoon, calls late at night, each one unanswered, each one stacking on top of the last until the number itself started to feel like a message, not from him, but from the situation unfolding behind those calls. Something was unraveling, something he had not accounted for when he made his decision, and I could almost trace it backwards without hearing a single explanation, because I knew exactly what detail had been overlooked, exactly what role I had been playing without acknowledgement, and exactly what happens when that role disappears without warning. And as I sat on my couch that night, scrolling through a list of missed calls that had climbed past 20, I let out a slow breath and said quietly, you finally noticed, not with satisfaction, not with anger, just recognition, because this was the moment the story had always been moving toward, not the night I left, not the silence that followed, but this, the point where absence turns into consequence. And for the first time since that dinner, I knew with complete certainty that whatever came next would not be on their terms. By the 4th day, the calls were no longer spaced out, they were stacked, layered so tightly together that my phone barely had time to go quiet before it lit up again, and I watched it from across the room at first, not out of avoidance, but out of observation, because there is a difference between reacting to something and understanding it, and I wanted to understand exactly how far this would go before I stepped in. And that morning alone there were 9 calls before 10 o'clock, each one shorter than the last, like he was not even waiting for it to ring out fully anymore, just pressing the call button again and again as if repetition would force a different outcome. And when I finally picked up my phone to check the latest voicemail, I could hear it clearly now. The control was gone, replaced by something tighter, sharper, something closer to urgency than authority. Tige, I need you to call me back. This is not something that can wait. And I paused the message there, not because I needed to hear more, but because I already knew the rest would not change what mattered. He was no longer speaking as someone who had made a decision. He was speaking as someone dealing with consequences he had not planned for. I set the phone down again and continued with my morning, poured my coffee, reviewed my schedule, moved through each task with the same steady pace I had built over the past weeks, because discipline is not just about what you do, it is about what you refuse to interrupt, and I refused to let his urgency become my responsibility again, not without understanding the full picture, not without clarity, and by the time I left my apartment, there were already 3 more missed calls, bringing the total for the day into double digits before noon. And still, I did not respond. It was not until later that afternoon that the first message from my mother appeared, and that, more than anything, confirmed that this was no longer contained, because she did not reach out lightly, not unless something had already escalated beyond what my father could manage on his own. Tige, please call your father, he is trying to reach you. The message was short, careful, almost neutral, but there was a weight behind it, a quiet pressure that had not been there before, and I read it twice before setting the phone down again. Because the wording mattered. She did not say what was wrong, she did not explain, she did not apologize, she simply redirected the responsibility back to me, and that told me exactly how they still saw the situation, not as something they needed to fix, but as something I was expected to resolve. I let the rest of the day pass without answering, and by the time evening came, the number of missed calls had climbed higher than I had expected, past 20 for the day alone. Each one building on the last until it became less about communication and more about pressure, and I stood in my kitchen again, looking at the screen, letting the pattern settle into something clear, something undeniable, because patterns reveal intention faster than words ever can, and this pattern was simple. Something had gone wrong, something significant enough to break through weeks of silence, something tied directly to the role I had been quietly filling before I left, and I did not need to guess what it was. I already knew. I had known from the moment I walked out of that house and chose not to correct him, not to explain, not to remind him of the one detail he had dismissed so easily. I leaned against the counter, arms crossed, and allowed myself a moment to think it through completely, not emotionally, not defensively, but logically, tracing the timeline backwards, the decisions, the assumptions, the gap between what he believed and what was actually true. And when the next call came in, lighting up the screen again with his name, I did not feel the urge to answer. I felt something else entirely, clarity, because this was no longer about being heard, it was about being needed, and those are not the same thing, not even close. I let it ring, just like the others, and when it stopped, I picked up the phone, scrolled through the list slowly, counting without really needing to, 23 calls, all from him, all unanswered, and I exhaled quietly before speaking out loud, not to anyone else, but to the moment itself. You made your decision, and then, after a brief pause, I added, softer, steadier, now you get to live with it. And for the first time since the calls began, I did not feel like I was waiting for something to happen. I felt like I was deciding when it would. I let another full day pass before I touched my phone with any intention of responding, not because I needed more proof, but because I needed the pattern to fully reveal itself, and by then it had, completely, unmistakably, and the shift was no longer subtle, it was obvious, because the messages had changed, not just in frequency, but in tone, in structure, in the way his words no longer assumed control but asked for it. And when I finally sat down at my kitchen table that evening and pressed play on the latest voicemail, I heard something I had never heard from him before, not even once in my entire life: hesitation. Tige, I may have misunderstood a few things, he said, his voice slower, measured in a way that felt unfamiliar, like he was choosing each word carefully instead of speaking with certainty. I need you to call me back so we can clear this up, and I paused the message there, because that phrase, clear this up, told me everything I needed to know. He still believed this was a misunderstanding, still believed this could be corrected with a conversation, still believed I would step back into the role I had always played, and that belief was the exact reason I had not answered yet. I placed the phone down and leaned back in my chair, letting the silence settle around me again, because silence had become something different now. It was no longer empty, it was active, it held weight, it shaped the situation more than any words could, and I knew that the moment I responded, everything would shift again, not just for him, but for me, and that was not something I was willing to rush. The next morning, the call started earlier than before 8 o'clock, before I had even finished my first cup of coffee, and when I checked my phone, there were already 6 missed calls waiting, followed by a message that stood out from the rest, not from him, but from my sister, and that alone was enough to make me stop and read it carefully, because she did not reach out unless she had a reason that directly affected her. "Can you please just call him?" she wrote, no greeting, no context. Just urgency. This is getting out of hand, and I stared at that sentence longer than I expected, because of what it implied, not what it said. This is getting out of hand meant something had escalated beyond what they could manage internally, something that was now affecting more than just him, and for the first time since the calls began, I allowed myself to consider the full scope of what might be happening behind the scenes, not as a guess, but as a logical outcome of the one detail they had ignored. I stood up from the table, walked over to the window, and looked out at the parking lot below, quiet, unchanged, completely separate from whatever tension was building on the other side of those calls, and I spoke softly, almost to myself. "You really did not think this through," not as an accusation, but as a statement of fact, because if he had taken even a moment to consider how things actually worked instead of how he believed they worked, none of this would be happening right now. By midday, the number had climbed again, higher than the day before, and the pattern was accelerating, not stabilizing, which meant whatever issue had triggered this had not been resolved, not even partially, and that confirmed the last piece I needed. This was not a minor inconvenience, this was structural. Something fundamental had been disrupted, something that could not simply be ignored or worked around, and I knew exactly what it was, because I had been the one holding it together, quietly, consistently, without acknowledgement, without recognition, and the moment I stepped away, the system they relied on had begun to collapse. I returned to my chair, picked up my phone, and for the first time since the call started, I did not just look at it. I considered answering, not out of pressure, not out of obligation, but because the moment had finally arrived where silence had done its job. It had revealed everything it needed to reveal, and continuing it would not add anything new. It would only delay what was already inevitable. And when the phone rang again, his name appearing on the screen with the same urgency as before, I let it ring for a few seconds longer than necessary, not to make a point, but to make a decision, and then, calmly, deliberately, I reached out and ended the call without answering, because even now, even at this point, the timing still belonged to me, and I was not ready to give that up just yet. I woke up the next morning already knowing that something had crossed a line overnight, not because I had checked my phone yet, but because of the quiet certainty that comes when a situation has reached its breaking point. And when I finally picked up my phone from the nightstand, the screen confirmed it immediately. 27 missed calls, all from him, stacked one after another in a way that made it impossible to pretend this was still under control, and for a moment I just looked at the number without reacting, because numbers like that do not represent communication, they represent urgency, pressure, and a level of dependence that no one ever admits out loud, especially not someone like him. I got out of bed, moved through my routine without rushing, showered, got dressed, made coffee, because I was not going to let his panic dictate the pace of my day, not anymore. And when I finally sat down at the table, I pressed play on the latest voicemail, and this time there was no hesitation in his voice, just strain, raw and unfiltered. "Tige, I need you to call me back right now, this is serious." And then a pause, longer than before, followed by something I had never heard from him directed at me, not once, "Please," and I closed my eyes briefly after hearing that, not because it moved me emotionally, but because it confirmed the final shift I had been waiting for. He was no longer operating from authority, he was operating from need. I set the phone down and leaned back, letting that realization settle completely, because this was the moment everything changed, not the night he told me to leave, not the weeks of silence, but this, the moment he reached a point where he had no choice but to ask instead of demand, and I knew exactly why. I had known from the beginning, but now it was no longer a theory, it was visible in his behavior, undeniable in the pattern of calls, the tone of his messages, the involvement of my mother and my sister, all of it pointing to the same conclusion: something he relied on was gone, and he could not replace it without me. I stood up, walked over to the counter, and opened my laptop, pulling up the records I had kept meticulously for years, not out of paranoia, but out of habit, because I had learned early that clarity is not something you leave to memory. And as I reviewed the documents, the transfers, the agreements, the responsibilities that had quietly been under my control, I felt no anger, no satisfaction, just confirmation. Everything was exactly where I had left it. Unchanged, except for one critical detail: my absence. I remembered the last conversation we had before I left, the way he had dismissed everything I contributed without asking what it actually was, the way he had reduced it to nothing because it did not fit his understanding, and I had let him, deliberately, because correcting him in that moment would have changed the outcome. It would have delayed this exact situation, and I needed him to experience it fully, without explanation, without warning, because that is the only way people truly understand the weight of what they ignore. My phone buzzed again on the table, another call, same name, same urgency, and this time I did not ignore it immediately. I let it ring while I looked at the screen, not as someone avoiding a problem, but as someone deciding how to address it, and when it stopped, a new message appeared almost instantly, shorter than the others, more direct. Tige, I cannot fix this without you. And I stared at that sentence longer than I expected, not because it surprised me, but because he had finally said it, not clearly, not completely, but enough to acknowledge what had been true all along. And for a moment the room felt completely still, like everything had aligned into a single point of clarity, and I exhaled slowly before speaking out loud: no, you cannot, not with arrogance, not with bitterness, just with certainty, because this was not about proving a point, it was about reality. Catching up to perception, I picked up the phone, scrolled through the list of missed calls again, counted them without needing to, 27, exactly, and then I placed the phone back down in front of me, fingers resting lightly against the edge of the table, because I understood now that this was no longer about whether I would respond, it was about how, and more importantly, when, and that decision carried more weight than anything I could say. And as the next call came through, cutting through the silence once again, I looked at it for a brief second before turning the screen face down, not to avoid it, but to control it, because for the first time in this entire situation, the outcome did not depend on what he wanted, it depended on what I chose to do next, and I was going to make sure that choice was mine, completely, without pressure, without urgency, and without forgetting exactly how we got here. I did not answer immediately, not even after everything had become unmistakably clear, because this was the exact moment where most people make a mistake: they react to urgency instead of understanding it, and I had spent too long being the person who responded quickly just to keep everything from falling apart. So instead I gave myself time, not to think about whether I would help, but to decide how the truth would be delivered, and that distinction mattered more than anything else. I picked up my phone later that afternoon and scrolled back through the messages again, slower this time, reading each one carefully, not for emotion, but for information, and the shift was complete. There was no trace of the certainty he had shown that night, no authority, no dismissal, just repeated attempts to reach me without knowing how. And I could almost hear the frustration building between the lines, the confusion, the realization that whatever he thought he understood was no longer holding together, and I knew exactly where that realization would lead, because I had been holding that structure in place quietly for years without ever being asked how it worked. I opened my laptop again and pulled up the account details, the agreements, the documentation that connected everything, not complicated, not hidden, just overlooked. And I rested my hand on the trackpad for a moment, remembering the first time I had taken responsibility for it, not because anyone asked me to, but because it needed to be handled, and I had always been the one who handled things, the one who stepped in, fixed problems, kept systems running without drawing attention to it, and that had become so normal to them that they stopped seeing it entirely, reduced it to nothing, just like he had done that night. And now, without that support, everything had started to break exactly the way I knew it would. My phone rang again, the same name lighting up the screen, and this time I did not let it go to voicemail right away. I watched it for a few seconds longer than usual, letting the moment settle, because once I answered, there would be no going back to silence, no returning to observation. This would move everything forward, and I needed to be certain that I was stepping into it on my terms, not his. When the call stopped, another message came through immediately, shorter, more direct than anything before. Tige, please. This is affecting everything. I need you to call me. And I read it twice, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to understand exactly how far he had come from where he started, and the difference was undeniable. He was no longer explaining, no longer justifying, he was admitting, not fully, not clearly, but enough to reveal the truth underneath it, and that was all I needed. I stood up from the table, walked over to the window again, and looked out at the same quiet view I had seen every day since I left, unchanged, stable, completely separate from the urgency building on the other side of those calls, and I spoke softly, not to him, but to the situation itself. You finally see it, and for the first time, I allowed myself to acknowledge the full weight of what that meant, not as a victory, but as a shift in reality, because once someone sees what they have been ignoring, they cannot unsee it, and everything that follows is shaped by that understanding. I returned to the table, picked up my phone, and this time I did not hesitate. I did not overthink it. I pressed call before I could reconsider, not out of impulse, but because the moment had arrived exactly where it needed to, and as the line rang on the other end, once, twice, 3 times, I felt something settle in me, not tension, not anticipation, just control, and when he finally answered, his voice came through immediately, too quickly, like he had been waiting with the phone in his hand. Tige, he said, the name coming out sharper than usual, not because he meant it that way, but because he had not prepared for how this conversation would actually begin, and I did not rush to fill the silence. I let it sit there for a second before responding, calm, steady, exactly the way I had always spoken. Hello, Dad, and that was enough, just those 2 words, because they shifted everything. They forced him into a space where he could not control the direction of the conversation, and for a brief moment, he did not say anything, and then finally, the truth started to surface, not as a full explanation, but as a question, uncertain, strained. Why did everything stop working? And I closed my eyes for a second when I heard that, not because I was surprised, but because it confirmed what I had known from the beginning. He did not understand what had changed, he only knew that something had, and that was the difference between us. I had always understood how things worked, and he had always assumed they would continue working without needing to know why, and when I opened my eyes again, I answered him simply, without raising my voice, without adding anything unnecessary, because I left, and I let that sit there, not explaining further, not filling in the gaps. Because the meaning was already clear, and for the first time in that entire conversation, he did not interrupt, he did not argue, he did not correct me, he just went quiet, and in that silence, everything shifted exactly the way it was supposed to. He did not respond right away after I said it, and that silence was different from the ones before, not empty, not uncertain, but heavy, like something had finally landed in a way he could not ignore, and I let it sit there without interrupting, because this was the first time he was not controlling the pace of the conversation, and I was not going to take that away from him by filling the space too quickly. What do you mean? Because you left, he said. Finally, slower now, his voice lower, like he was trying to piece something together in real time, and I could hear it clearly, the shift from frustration to realization, not complete, not comfortable, but undeniable, and I leaned back slightly in my chair, keeping my tone calm, measured, exactly as it had been from the beginning. I mean exactly that, Dad. The things that stopped working were not automatic, they were being handled, and I did not rush to explain further, because I needed him to follow the logic himself, to connect the pieces without me handing them to him, and for a moment he did not say anything, and then I heard him exhale sharply, the kind of breath someone takes when they realize they have missed something obvious, something important. You are saying that you were, what, managing all of that? He asked, and there was something unfamiliar in his voice now, not just confusion, but doubt, not in me, but in his own understanding of the situation, and I nodded slightly even though he could not see me. Yes, I said simply, I was, and again, I stopped there, because the weight of that statement was not in how much I said, but in how little I needed to say for it to be clear. He let out a short laugh after that, but it was not the same laugh from before, it was tight, controlled, almost defensive. That does not make sense, Tige. I would have known if something like that depended on you. And I allowed a small pause before answering, not to challenge him, but to give him time to hear what he had just said. Would you? I replied quietly, or did you assume everything would keep working without asking why? And that landed exactly where it needed to, because he did not respond immediately this time, and when he did, the certainty was gone completely, replaced by something much closer to concern. So what exactly did you do? He asked, more carefully now, and I could hear it. The shift from dismissal to inquiry, from control to dependence. And I turned slightly in my chair, resting my elbow on the table, keeping my voice steady. I handled the accounts, I coordinated the payments, I kept everything current, I made sure nothing fell behind, and I paused briefly before adding, quietly, because that word mattered, more than the rest, and I knew he would hear it. There was a longer silence after that, and when he spoke again, it was softer, almost cautious. That explains a few things, he admitted, and that admission, small as it was, carried more weight than anything he had said before, because it meant he was no longer denying the reality of the situation. He was adjusting to it, and that is the point where people start to understand consequences. Things are not lining up the way they used to, he continued, choosing his words more carefully now. There are delays, issues, things that should not be happening, and I listened without interrupting, because this was not information I needed, it was confirmation, and when he finished, I responded calmly, that is what happens when the system changes, and I let that sit for a second before continuing, or when the person managing it is no longer there, and again, I did not raise my voice, did not emphasize anything, because the truth does not need volume to carry weight. He cleared his throat after that, and I could hear the tension in it now, not anger, not frustration, but pressure, the kind that builds when someone realizes they are no longer in control of something they thought they understood completely. So what do we do now? He asked, and that question changed everything, because it was no longer about what he wanted, it was about what he needed, and more importantly, it placed the decision in my hands without him fully realizing it, and I leaned forward slightly, resting my hand on the table, letting the moment settle before I answered, because this was the point where clarity mattered more than speed. That depends, I said, my tone even, controlled, on whether you are asking me to fix it, or whether you are finally trying to understand it. And I could feel the shift again on the other end of the line, the hesitation, the recalibration. Because for the first time, he was not just reacting to a problem, he was facing the person who had been holding it together all along, and he did not know how to navigate that yet, and I did not rush to help him, because this was the part he needed to experience fully, without shortcuts, without assumptions, and without me stepping in before he understood exactly why he needed me in the first place. I did not answer his question right away, not because I did not have an answer, but because this was the moment where everything needed to settle exactly where it was, without me softening it, without me stepping in too quickly like I always had before, and I could hear it in the silence on the other end, the waiting, the uncertainty, the unfamiliar position he had been forced into, and for the first time, I was not the one adjusting to keep things smooth, he was. That depends, I repeated calmly, letting my words land with intention, on whether you are asking me to step back into the same role without understanding it, or whether you are ready to acknowledge what that role actually was. And there was a pause after that, longer than any before, not empty, but heavy, like something inside him was shifting in a way he could not ignore anymore, and when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, more controlled. I think I understand now, he said, but there was hesitation in it. Not confidence, and I did not challenge him directly, I simply responded, understanding is not something you think, Dad, it is something you show, and I let that sit there, because this was not about proving a point, it was about setting a boundary that had never existed before. He exhaled slowly, and I could hear the tension in it, not frustration, not anger, but the weight of realizing that the situation was no longer something he could direct or dismiss. So what do you need from me? He asked, and that question, simple as it sounded, marked the final shift, because he was no longer asking what we should do, he was asking what I required, and that difference mattered more than anything else he had said. I leaned back slightly, keeping my tone even, respectful, the same way I had always spoken to him, but this time without giving anything away that I was not choosing to give. I need clarity, I said. I need acknowledgement, not assumptions, and I need to know that if I step back into anything, it will not be treated as invisible again, and I did not raise my voice, did not add emphasis, because the weight of what I was saying did not come from how I said it, it came from the fact that I was finally saying it at all. There was another silence after that, and I let it stretch, because I was no longer responsible for filling it, and when he spoke again, it was slower, more deliberate. "I did not realize how much you were doing," he admitted, and that sentence, simple and incomplete, carried more honesty than anything he had said before, because it was not defensive, it was not dismissive, it was just true, and I nodded slightly, even though he could not see it. "No, you did not," I replied, not as an accusation, but as a statement, and I let the quiet settle again, because sometimes acknowledgement does not need to be expanded, it just needs to exist. "Can you help fix this?" he asked after a moment, and I noticed the way he said it, not as a demand, not as an expectation, but as a request, and that difference was exactly what I had been waiting for, not the problem itself, not the urgency, but the shift in how he approached me, and I allowed myself a brief pause before answering, not to create tension, but to ensure that what I said next was completely intentional. "I can help," I said calmly, but not the way I did before, and I let that line sit there clearly, without explanation, because it did not need one, it defined the boundary on its own. He did not interrupt, did not push back, and that told me everything I needed to know. He understood, maybe not completely, maybe not comfortably, but enough to recognize that things were no longer the same, and I continued, my tone steady, composed. "If I am involved, it will be transparent, it will be acknowledged, and it will be respected," and I paused briefly before adding, softer but no less firm, "otherwise, it stays exactly the way it is now." And that was it, no anger, no raised voice, no emotional weight beyond what was already there, just clarity, simple and direct, and for a moment neither of us spoke, and then finally he said, "All right," and there was something in that word, something that had not been there before, not authority, not certainty, but acceptance, quiet, measured, real. When the call ended, I placed my phone down on the table and sat there for a moment, letting the silence return, but this time it felt different, not like absence, not like distance, but like space, space that I had created, space that I controlled, and I looked around my apartment, the same small place that had felt like a temporary solution just weeks ago, and realized it was something else entirely now. It was proof that I could step away, rebuild, and return only on my own terms, and as I stood up and moved toward the window, I allowed myself one final thought, not loud, not dramatic, just clear and steady. "He did not lose control when I left," I said quietly. "He lost what he never realized he depended on, and this time, I did not need to correct him, because now he already knew."